Jennifer Smith, and I am the manager of the Stormwater, Dam Safety, and Flood Management Program. And this is one of 8 programs in the Water and Science Administration of the Maryland Department of the Environment. We are very excited today to talk about stormwater management and urban flooding. And this is a very important topic on the minds of many of us in the state of Maryland. And we are all here today because of our shared value around protecting people and places from harm caused by flooding, and in particular, our most vulnerable communities. Today we have, it looks like 67 registered people who have joined us. We had 100 registered. We may get some more joining us as we go. This is a really great turnout for the Eastern and Southern Maryland regions, so thank you all for joining us. Each of you here today plays a very important role in ensuring our communities and citizens remain safe from flooding and its impacts. You all represent Maryland's stormwater regulators, floodplain managers, and local planners, and we greatly appreciate all the work that you do at the local level. Now, hopefully during today's session, we can provide some information on our approach to advancing stormwater resiliency in Maryland. And your input and participation will be very crucial to ensuring that this effort is successful. Today, you will hear about opportunities where we need your help, whether it be providing technical expertise and advice or providing data and information. Now, I'm going to turn this over to Christina Lyerly, who's going to help us with some housekeeping information.
Thank you, Jennifer. Please note that we are recording today's session. The recordings will be available on the MDE Hub website in the near future. More information on the Hub website will be discussed later in today's presentation. Because we have a large number of people registered, we muted microphones to manage background noise. We've also turned off video capability of participants to save bandwidth. If you are bumped off the webinar, lose a connection, or have other technical difficulties, please leave and re-enter the session. Please use the Q&A tool to submit questions and comments. We will address those at the end of the presentation. It is important that we receive and understand all of your thoughts. If you think of questions after today's presentation, feel free to email us. We'll provide contact information at the end. We plan to gather the questions and answers and post them on our Hub website. Please feel welcome to engage in conversations with your fellow participants using the chat function. If you would like to submit a question or comment that you would like addressed by the presenters, however, please use the Q&A tool. These questions will help us develop the Q&A that will be available online. Next slide, please. To access the Q&A tool, click on the cluster of 3 shapes in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. The activities box will open up. Click on the Q&A option, then click the Ask a Question box. You'll simply need to type in your question and then click Post. If you see questions that others have posted that you also have a strong interest in, you can click the thumbs up right next to the question. These votes are recorded, which can give us a sense of the importance of each topic. Next slide, please. We plan to launch a number of polls throughout the presentation. The process for participating in poll questions is similar. The poll will not automatically appear once it's launched. To access it, click on the 3 clustered symbols again, click on the polls option in the activities box, and then participate in the poll when it opens up on the right. To get us started on poll questions, we would like to learn about who is in the room today. These initial meetings represent the first steps to reaching out to local governments. The job functions most represented for those who registered include stormwater management, engineers, the MS4 program, and floodplain management. However, we realize that this effort is important and of interest to broader coalitions. This has been demonstrated in the registrations for these meetings. To see who is represented today, please take the poll that can be found by following these steps, and I will launch that now. I'll give it a few more moments so that we can get some more votes. So far, we've had 41 people participate, so that's great. Okay, right now, the largest representation is local government. And we have some state government folks joining us as well, and some consultants. So thank you all for joining us. Next slide, please. Today's speakers include representatives from the Maryland Department of the Environment who are involved daily in flood management, stormwater management, and dam safety. Opening remarks will be given by Matt Rowe, MDE's Assistant Director of the Water and Science Administration. Les Knapp, Senior Local Advisor in the Office of the Secretary, will give an introduction to Senate Bill 227. Flooding and existing programs in Maryland will then be discussed by Jennifer Smith and Ray Barr, Program Manager and Deputy Program Manager of the Stormwater, Dam Safety, and Flood Management Program. Maryland's approach to SB 227 will also be discussed by Jennifer and Ray, along with Stu Comstock, Dave Gannett, Kevin Wagner, and Brian Cooper. Finally, Debbie Capacity will review our collective next steps. I will moderate the Q&A discussion after the presentation has concluded. Now, I will turn it over to Matt for his opening remarks.
Thanks, Christina, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here today. As Christina mentioned, I'm the Assistant Director in the Water and Science Administration, stepping in for Lee Curry today. I know the two meetings he had last week, Lee gave the opening remarks, so and wishes he could be here, but I'm happy to step in and give him a break while he's with his family this week. So I'm really happy to be here. It's really exciting too that we have so much local government participation. You know, is a lot of the implementers for stormwater down on the ground. It's so important and encouraging that you're here today to help us through this challenging endeavor of modernizing our stormwater program in the face of climate change and resiliency and kind of this new normal that we're all experiencing. So I want to go a little bit through the purpose of coming here together today, what we know and what we can do to advance and modernize stormwater in the face of climate. So today you're going to hear from several members of MDE, including one of our senior policy advisors, Les Knapp, and members of MDE's recently retitled Stormwater, Dam Safety, and Flood Management program, which is a program with a strong emphasis and focus on climate change resiliency and preparedness. And I want to thank Jen and her whole team. They've put so much work into this. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank them for all their efforts. The speakers today will share with you how we can work together to make our communities more resilient and better prepared for flooding. And more specifically, they'll share an approach to modernizing Maryland stormwater regulations. As you're aware, local land use planning is already being informed by updated flood maps and state policies like CoSmart and updates to the water resources element. I know my colleague Jason Dubois at Maryland Department of Planning and I have been reaching out and having some webinars with local governments on the water resources element and how to integrate flood considerations and climate considerations into the land use planning process. So that's been exciting. And it's time to apply some of that same thinking to the urban stormwater management in our developed communities, and notably areas subject to flooding. So this thinking's guided by the state stormwater management statutory requirement to reduce as nearly as possible the adverse effects of stormwater runoff and to safeguard life, limb, property, and public welfare. So that's in our statutory charge here in the department. And today we're going to provide some details on a law that became effective in June 21 that resulted in this outreach we're doing with you today, and also the requirement for the department to develop a plan to advance stormwater resilience in Maryland, a plan that we refer to as our A-Storm plan. So we all have a critical role and a shared responsibility because our communities are depending on us to take the appropriate actions to safeguard lives, property, and especially those who are in our most vulnerable or frequently flooded areas. So with that purpose and background for coming together here today, let me talk a little bit about what we know today. So we know that urban flooding is a significant source of economic loss, social disruption, and housing inequality. Urban flooding can result in property damage, reconstruction costs, road closures. In the department, I know we'll often get emergency permits or emergency requests for repairs for roads, culverts, bridges, things that have washed out during flooding, and we're certainly seeing that happen more frequently. Climate change is making more extreme and intense rainfall more likely, and we're also experiencing more frequent microbursts and cloudbursts, resulting in flash floods. These torrential downpours that Maryland recently experienced overwhelmed drainage systems that flooded many roads, businesses, and homes, causing property damage and death. And you'll see some videos later on in the workshop today on the Ellicott City flooding, which I'm sure you're all aware of. It's a poster child for some of these challenges. There's a lot of unique features with Ellicott City, but also a vulnerable area at the same time. Major flooding is occurring outside too of designated flood zones in Maryland. So we're seeing areas that we don't typically see flooding or that are outside of the 100-year floodplain. And so, that information alone, the 100-year floodplain, isn't sufficient to identify the geographic areas of concern. There's also been some recent studies by the Pew Trust that indicates that urban flooding interrupts daily life, delaying or blocking the passage of emergency response vehicles and people trying to get to work or school. And that report also showed how flooding disrupts travel, causes safety risks, and generates economic productivity losses, among other adverse consequences. So, the consequences of these flooding events and extreme weather and precipitation are, they're far and wide, they're far reaching. So what can we do now, knowing this? And again, how can we work together moving forward? So one thing that we can do is proactively position Maryland to respond to tomorrow's flood risks. Several steps to accomplishing this include just being aware. Knowledge is key, and we're more empowered with information. So knowing where flood risk areas are located so we can better plan for emergencies, protect downstream communities, and improve stormwater conveyance infrastructure, and also increase flood literacy in our communities. Arming our citizens and ourselves with knowledge is really, and that awareness is the first step. So use today and maybe the tomorrows that are ahead, and rainfall estimates for better decision-making and stormwater design. So, we need to think about projections too, not only what we're seeing in the Atlas 14 and, historical rainfall information we have to date, but we also need to be thinking about models and projections and what does the future look like and how do we adapt? Modernizing Maryland stormwater regulations to safeguard life, property, public health, and welfare is really one of our fundamental charges. So we need to keep our eye on that, position our counties, cities, and communities to seek new resources to reduce our risks in these flood-prone areas. So we can do this in a way that's implementable across the state, and we look forward to working with you on that. I also can't think of a better time to hold these webinars than April, because April, if you all aren't aware, is Flood Awareness Month. In April 2021 of last year, Governor Hogan proclaimed April as Flood Awareness Month, and this is our second year of acknowledging, floods and raising awareness, kind of back to the knowledge is key. This year's theme is Know, Plan, Act. So know your risk, make a plan, and act on your plan. If I want to leave you with one thought today, that would be a sense of urgency, so that today, now, we better position Maryland to respond to tomorrow's urban stormwater flood risks, the risks we know are increasing and are a growing threat. So with that, I'd like to now introduce you to our next speaker, Les Knapp. Les comes to MDE with extensive experience with the counties through his role in MACO, which I believe will be invaluable in helping to define implementable solutions. Les is a senior policy advisor in our Office of the Secretary, with one of his focus areas being stormwater management. So we're really fortunate to have Les here at MDE, especially involved in this A-Storm plan. And Les will explain the statutory changes that led to A-Storm and how we're going to navigate through the challenges or heavy seas and precipitation ahead. So thank you. And Les?
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Les Knapp, Senior Local Advisor in the Office of the Secretary at MDE. And I want to first build a little bit on the fundamental question, why are we here? Why are we doing A-Storm? And as Jennifer and Matt previously noted, severe weather events, sea level rise, and climate change are contributing to increased flooding that threatens our communities, residents, and natural heritage. Flooding can also be especially devastating to your economically disadvantaged or historically neglected communities. And as Matt alluded to, it can also target our vital infrastructure. For example, from 2006 to 2020, there have been more than 2,500 flood-related incidents on state-maintained roadways, often requiring closures and repairs. And as many in this audience knows, that's only a small fraction of the total road miles in Maryland. Most of them are local responsibility. So in short, flooding affects the operations of all levels of government. Local land use planning is already being informed by newer flood maps and state policies like CoastSmart. It is time to apply the same principles to stormwater management in our developed communities and areas that are subject to flooding. We need to work together to solve this challenge of flooding prevention and resiliency, and this is going to be just the first step in a long-term process that will continue into the future. Next slide, please. So the General Assembly also recognized flooding and stormwater management as priority issues, and in 2021, they passed legislation, Senate Bill 227, House Bill 295, that set forth a framework and some requirements that MDE and local governments must follow as we move forward. Links to the bills are available below on the slide, as well, I believe, is in the chat, and the bills are identical, so you can look at either one. First, MDE must submit a report by November of 2021 that outlines a process for meeting the bill's requirements. And this submitted report is known as the StoRM report for short. And a link to it is also below, and I believe will be put in the chat as well. Next, MDE must identify the most recent precipitation data available and investigate flooding events since 2000 to identify potential areas of concern. Finally, MDE must revise Maryland stormwater quantity management standards every 5 years based on the most recent precipitation and flooding data, and also update other stormwater regulations as necessary every 5 years. Now, some of you may still be carrying scars from the last major stormwater update in 2009. I know I am from my time at MACO, where MDE moved to a standard of environmental site design to the maximum extent practicable, or ESD to the MEP. And the prospect of revisiting this every 5 years may not be pleasant. However, MDE is approaching this process as akin to updating a local comprehensive plans. As you know, comp plans have to be reviewed every 10 years, but that does not mean they are completely rewritten every time. MDE plans on taking the same approach. So if the data indicates that changes are needed, then we're going to roll up our sleeves and work through the changes. However, if the data indicates no changes are needed, MDE is not looking to change something that is working. And I hope this approach makes sense to you. I also want to assure you that you will be part of this process. Next slide, please. So the legislation also required MDE to consult with certain groups at least 6 months in advance of all proposed regulatory changes. And these groups include the Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities, and a new stakeholder group that includes the listed members on the slide, and which most importantly for this audience includes local governments. That is counties, municipalities, MACO, and MML. And MDE aims to have this stakeholder group formed by June. In addition to the required consultations, MDE also plans to form various technical advisory groups and also accept questions and comments on the newly formed StoRM hub, which you will hear more about later. So even if you represent a stakeholder group that is not directly listed in the legislation, don't worry, there are going to be ample opportunities for you to participate directly. Next slide, please. So finally, MDE has established 7 guiding principles that will govern how we will navigate the StoRM process. Following these 7 C's should allow for as smooth a process as possible. The first is communication. MDE will have open and transparent conversation with all interested stakeholders. Number 2 is consultation. MDE will solicit input from all interested stakeholders and consider the received feedback. Number 3 is collection. MDE will utilize new scientific tools, and existing local knowledge to improve data acquisition and analysis. Number 4 is coordination. MDE plans to incorporate and grow existing data sets and programs where feasible. There is no need to reinvent the wheel here. Next slide, please. Number 5 is consistency. MDE will apply rational and logical principles to both a storm and any regulatory outcomes. There should be no surprises when it comes to data updates or proposed reg changes. Number 6 is capability. MDE recognizes that there are different abilities and resources in different local jurisdictions and wants to avoid a one-size-fits-all mentality with respect to desired outcomes and regulatory requirements. And finally, number 7 is culmination. MDE hopes to create accurate flood data, incorporate resiliency into the stormwater management regulations, and establish a practical process for the future review and potential revisions of stormwater regulations going forward. So that concludes my portion of the presentation, and I will now turn back to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you, Les. MDE has received a number of questions from the local jurisdictions on how we are going to respond to the requirements of Senate Bill 227 and how we're going to implement the proposed steps in the Advancing Stormwater Resiliency in Maryland report. And quite frankly, we have had many of these same questions ourselves. For example, what type of flooding is MDE going to address? And what size watershed is MDE interested in when defining flooding events? Today, we hope to answer some of these questions and others over the next 6 to 12 months. And again, I cannot emphasize enough that we hope this process is a collaborative effort with your input along the way. Maryland has a very strong stormwater community, and MDE does not have all the answers. We will need your help to develop a well thought out community response to these directives to ensure that we get it right with no unintended consequences. So I'm going to now put you all on the spot and ask you a trivia question as one of your poll questions. So next slide, please. Okay, so remember, go to the 3 shapes at the bottom corner of your screen to post your answer under the poll function. Okay, the question is, how deep does the water need to be to float a car? Potential responses are 1/2 of a foot, 1 foot, 1.5 feet, or 2 feet.
Okay, looking at the poll results, it's so far 1/2 foot is winning, but the 1 foot answer is close behind. So let's go ahead and see what the answer is. 1 foot can carry away most cars. 2 feet can carry away SUVs and trucks.
Thank you, Christina. Now I'm going to turn this over to Ray Barr, who is going to present a video clip of one of the recent Ellicott City flooding events.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Jennifer. Before we get into the details of Senate Bill 227 and the department's proposed ideas in response to the new law, we wanted to share a video with you from one of the recent Ellicott City floods that Howard County and Mark Richmond have kindly shared with us. This event represents both the past and the future. It shows how numerous local, state, and federal agencies work together in responding to this tragic event, but it's also a charge to this group for developing and implementing additional stormwater quantity management in all of our communities and hopefully preventing future catastrophes like this one from ever happening again. So let's watch the video.
What's 8141, and the water's getting higher and higher on her.
Okay, what's the name of that business?
It's called DIVAZ Boutique. It's 8141 Main Street.
All right, look. Stay with me, okay? Stay on line.
Okay.
Is she on the first floor? Tell me.
She's on the first floor. She's right now standing on top of her counter screaming. I told one of the fire and rescue guys that was here she was over there, and they said they were going to try to get to her. And right now, you can't get across this damn street.
Okay, about how much water is in the building now?
It's going halfway up the inside of the building. She's screaming at the top of her lungs.
All right, just stay with me, okay?
Okay. God, this is worse than the last one.
Hi, this is 911. Somebody from this number just called and hung up. Is everybody okay?
No, there's water in my store.
Okay.
It's flooding in Ellicott City.
All right, what's the store you in?
Culture Lab,
What's the address?
8133 Main Street.
Okay, and it's flooding inside there, you said?
Yeah, it's flooding down here on Main Street.
Okay.
It just came in my front and back door. We're up in the attic right now.
Okay.
Howard County 911, what's the location of your emergency?
P on the Tiber, Ellicott City, Maryland.
You're where? Tiber?
P on the Tiber.
T on the Tiber? All right, what's wrong?
Ma'am, this case is flooding. We're in Old Ellicott.
All right, give me the address there, because I can't put it in as a common name. Give me the address.
It's 8081 Main Street.
Thank you, Ray, for that video. That video really shows how dangerous these flooding events can be. Maryland communities have recently seen and experienced an increase in the number of these short duration, high intensity storm events. And we have recently seen many events with nearly 5 inches or more of rainfall in a very short time frame. And they've occurred all over the state. And while not any of them have been as devastating as those 2 Ellicott City storms, they have resulted in heavy property damage. Now, many local jurisdictions have begun to map these frequently flooding areas and prioritize their locations. And they have begun to study the stormwater conveyance systems and try to develop some flooding solutions. Next slide, please. So I want to look at why these flooding events are occurring in Maryland and what we are currently doing to try to address them. Maryland has many older urban areas that were developed prior to federal and local floodplain management requirements. Historically, development occurred along rivers and in floodplains where shipping access was available. Development along streams and rivers and upstream of the FEMA floodplain essentially went unchecked until after 1968, when the National Flood Insurance Program was created. Now, Maryland has 147 communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, and all of these communities have local floodplain ordinances. However, it wasn't until the early 1980s that stormwater runoff from development upstream of these floodplains was regulated in Maryland. Now, Maryland is nationally recognized as one of the most progressive FEMA floodplain mapping programs, with model-backed digital flood insurance rate maps, or DFIRMs, for 21 of the 24 counties in the state. Many local jurisdictions have mapped their local 100-year floodplains as well. However, it is important to recognize that these FEMA digital flood insurance rate maps are based on land cover conditions that existed at the time the map was generated. And except for 4 interjurisdictional watersheds, Maryland's state stormwater management criteria for new development does not require management of the 100-year storm. FEMA does offer discounted flood insurance to property owners living in communities participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. And in Maryland, this represents $16 billion of flood insurance across the state. And 16 of the 147 participating communities receive further insurance rate discounts because they participate in something called the community rating system. Now you can go to the DFIRM maps on the website on this slide, and I think that's also going to be put into the chat function. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about tidal flooding and sea level rise, which is something of interest to the eastern and southern Maryland regions. Flooding from tidal influences and sea level rise is particularly devastating to Maryland coastal communities. Tidal influences and sea level rise can result in temporary road closures, overwhelmed drainage systems, and inundated properties. And adding precipitation and wind can greatly prolong these flooding events and cause flooding upland due to backwater effects. And while not necessarily stormwater driven, in 2019, Maryland lawmakers recognized the importance of tidal flooding on property, transportation, and commerce, and passed a law that requires the local jurisdictions experiencing what they termed nuisance flooding to develop a plan to address it. Now there are 17 of these nuisance flood plans available, and they've been developed with the help of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, who also provides funding for projects and tools for mapping and identifying hazards. In addition, MDE, in partnership with the state's Coast Smart Council, has developed the Coast Smart Climate Ready Action Boundary, otherwise known as the CRAB, to provide coastal communities with information on the extent of projected inundation areas after a 3-foot elevation is added to the FEMA tidal floodplain. This boundary is required to be used for state-funded projects with a cost of more than $500,000. And you can access this tool at the website that is listed on this slide. Next slide. Of course, flooding does not just occur in the FEMA or the local 100-year floodplains. And a recent study completed by the Pew Charitable Trust notes that more than 2/3 of flooding events on Maryland's roads and highways takes place outside of the FEMA mapped 100-year floodplains. So we should consider whether our existing stormwater conveyance infrastructure plays a role in the magnitude and the extent of flooding in Maryland. As our urban areas grew over the last 200 years, many local creeks and streams and low-lying areas were filled or replaced with closed storm drain conveyance systems. And many of these systems are aging, or they're in disrepair, or they're clogged, or they're undersized, and they cannot handle the amount or the intensity of rainfall and runoff draining to them, especially during these flashy, high-intensity thunderstorms. Rainfall exceeding the storm drain conveyance system capacity is then forced to flow overland and on the surface, and in many cases into areas not meant for runoff. And these areas with undersized conveyance systems experience what is called urban flooding. This flooding can be particularly damaging and dangerous, especially if our citizens are not expecting it. And many of these areas are located in our most vulnerable communities. Now, Maryland has historically left the sizing and maintenance of stormwater conveyance systems up to the local approval authorities. The engineering criteria and the design storm selections for the inlets and pipes and channel capacity is currently dictated at the local jurisdiction level, or for state roads by the Maryland Department of Transportation. Now, MDOT's culvert and storm drain sizing criteria may not be consistent with the local criteria. And even if it is designed to a certain storm size, the design storm rainfall amounts are most likely changing as we experience climate change. So what does your jurisdiction use as storm drain conveyance or culvert sizing criteria? And how do your local requirements compare with the state MDOT criteria? Are there inconsistencies between your criteria and the state criteria that create flooding issues where state roads cross through county jurisdictions? Should MDE regulate the capture and conveyance of stormwater runoff? Should MDE set minimum state standards for stormwater conveyance capacity? Now remember, Maryland's NPDES MS4 permits require jurisdictions and the State Highway Administration to map their storm drain conveyance infrastructure and maintain it. But it is likely that more needs to be done to understand where these systems are undersized and to provide upgrades where feasible. And don't forget, the importance of informing the public of these potential hazards cannot be overstated. Next slide, please. Of course, many point the finger to growth and new development as a cause of flooding, and then focus the solutions on requiring more stringent new development stormwater quantity management and floodplain regulations. Maryland's stormwater regulations currently require environmental site design to the maximum extent practicable, or otherwise known as ESD to the MEP, or the management of 2.7 inches of rainfall in smaller stormwater management practices distributed across a development site. Now, some say this minimum requirement is counterproductive to address climate change flooding impacts. what happens to these ESD practices designed to filter low-intensity rainfall events during a high-intensity storm? Maryland regulations require the management of the 2 or the 10-year 24-hour duration storm event to pre-development conditions where known flooding exists. How is this requirement being implemented? What about larger storms? Maryland regulations require management of the 100-year 24-hour duration storm event, but only in the interjurisdictional watersheds of the Gwynns Falls, Jones Falls, Herring Run, and Carroll Creek. Of course, there are other state and federal regulations that try to address the impacts of new development on flooding. For example, Maryland regulates activities within the floodplain of waters of the state, and FEMA regulates activities within a FEMA 100-year floodplain for drainage areas greater than 1 square mile. But are there gaps in these state requirements? And remember, in all cases, these regulations strive to prevent things from getting worse, but do they address existing problems? Next slide. Okay, I'm going to stop there and take a break and ask you all another trivia question. So remember, go to the 3 shapes at the bottom right corner of your screen and go to the poll function to provide your answer. The question is, true or false, living in the 100-year floodplain means you will only flood once every 100 years.
Okay, so far it is, the answers are 100% for false. So that might have been an easy one. Let's see what the answer is. That is correct, false. This is a common misconception. If you live in the flood zone, you have a 26% chance of flooding over your 30-year mortgage. A 100-year storm means there is a 1 in 100 or a 1% chance of that size storm hitting a certain area for a given year. Theoretically, a 100-year storm could hit in back-to-back years.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now let's add climate change to the mix. The 2017 National Climate Assessment reports that heavy downpours are increasing nationally, especially over the last 3 to 5 decades, that the largest increases are in the Midwest and Northeast, and that increases in the frequency and intensity of extreme precipitation events are projected for all U.S. regions. Recently, the Chesapeake Stormwater Network found that multiple studies demonstrate that the climate is not stationary, indicating that our current use of our intensity duration frequency curves, or IDF curves, that are based on historical precipitation data are likely to underestimate future precipitation. In addition, according to the Chesapeake Bay Program's climate assessment, the volume of annual rainfall is expected to increase in the Chesapeake Bay watershed by approximately 6.5% by 2055. So what will this mean to our stormwater conveyance systems that are already stressed? And what will this mean to the many existing properties that are located either in our 100-year floodplains or along the floodplain fringe? Should our stormwater management requirements for new and redevelopment account for future climate projections? Should climate change be factored into how we determine our local and FEMA floodplain boundaries? Next slide. So consider all of these issues together. And what is a local stormwater plan reviewer to do when new development is proposed upstream of areas where existing conveyance systems are undersized, and there are properties at risk located within a local or FEMA floodplain or along the floodplain fringe? How many of you in the audience today are plan reviewers that have faced a similar situation before? Requiring the 10-year quantity management or 2-year quantity management for these new development projects is not going to fix all of these downstream flooding problems. In these cases, having a watershed-specific plan that dictates the mitigation needed to solve or at least reduce these downstream flooding problems will be critical. In many cases, this will require overmanagement of stormwater runoff or management of something different than your standard peak control. Communities will need detailed information on their existing storm drain systems and training on the use of one-dimensional and two-dimensional hydraulic models to understand those complex relationships between riverine and urban overland flooding. Now I'm going to turn this over to Ray Barr, who's going to discuss the many state agencies working to mitigate these flooding problems. Ray?
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. So not only are there numerous reasons for why we're seeing more flooding, but there's also numerous local, state, and federal programs charged with mitigating these flooding events. And to be honest with you, before trying to figure out how to respond to the specific regulatory requirements found in Senate Bill 227, our staff was doing its homework, trying to figure out what everybody else was doing in response to flooding. So yes, today our charge is to focus on how Maryland's stormwater management program should implement additional quantity management in response to changing climate conditions. Next slide, please. But we would be remiss if we did not take advantage of this opportunity to take a more comprehensive look at why flooding is occurring, what others are doing in response to flooding, finding our niche, and how to connect the dots with all of the other flood management programs. So our process is not to ask you for the same information that other state and federal programs have already asked you for, but really to fill in the gaps, as Jennifer just talked about, with flood data that will complement and expand scope of local flood risk management, and to find out ways to better coordinate our efforts with those of existing programs to improve efficiencies, prioritize mitigation planning and projects, and make well-prepared applications for state and federal funds. Next slide, please. So with that bigger picture in mind, and the department's want to coordinate our efforts with all the existing efforts that are already out there, the balance of today's presentation is going to discuss the department's proposals for addressing the specifics of Senate Bill 227. None of them are written in stone, and we want to hear from you, what you think about them and what we are missing. So now back to Jennifer to discuss Maryland's most recent precipitation data. Jennifer?
Thanks, Ray. Okay, what do we know about Maryland's recent and future precipitation data? Next slide, please. First, let me point out that Senate Bill 227 defines precipitation data as historical data that describes the relationship between precipitation, intensity, duration, and return period or frequency. Now, in stormwater management design, these precipitation data, or intensity, duration, frequency curves, or IDF curves, are used as input into various hydrologic models to predict runoff rates and quantities. And this information is the basis for both stormwater quality and quantity management standards. Now, Maryland's stormwater management regulations and stormwater design manual currently require the use of IDF curves based on technical paper number 40, TP40. This was developed in 1961 by the United States Department of Agriculture Soil Conservation Service. In 2004, TP40 was replaced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA's Atlas 14. This document uses record data through December 2000 and represents what MDE considers the most recent precipitation data for Maryland. However, Maryland's stormwater management regulations and design manual have not been updated to require the use of this 2004 NOAA Atlas 14 precipitation data. However, we have made recommendations that it should be used, and many local jurisdictions are already doing so. Now, recently, MDE partnered with the Maryland Department of Transportation, the Federal Highway Administration, and the states of Delaware, Virginia, and North Carolina to have the 2004 NOAA Atlas 14 data updated to include record data through current conditions. This work has begun and is expected to be completed by 2025, and it will include future climate change projections. In addition, recently, a consortium of universities and the RAND Corporation published future projected IDF curves for the Chesapeake Bay watershed that are based on the current NOAA Atlas 14 precipitation data with a range of predictions for future climate change. The data are presented in an online tool that was developed by the Mid-Atlantic Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment, otherwise known as MRISA. The data is available for 3 emission scenarios with 4 confidence intervals and 2 time periods. The first time period being 2020 to 2070, and the second being 2050 to 2100. The tool can be found at the website on this slide, and I believe that's also going to be put into the chat function. MDE is currently evaluating the online tool to determine how it could be used to inform our regulations and design standards for controlling stormwater runoff in Maryland. Okay, next slide. Now, a few states and localities in the Mid-Atlantic area are already using or planning to use future climate precipitation projections in their stormwater management designs. Virginia Beach, for example, now requires a 20% increase over Atlas 14 precipitation values for stormwater management designs for new development. And Hampton Roads Planning District is also considering incorporating a similar climate change precipitation factor. The Virginia Department of Transportation requires a 20% increase over Atlas 14 for bridge design. And the New York State Department of Transportation requires a 10 to 20% increase over Atlas 14 for their culvert and natural channel design projects. The city of Pittsburgh has gone one step further. And in one watershed where they know they have conveyance capacity issues, they are requiring that post-development peak flows are calculated using the MRISA tool's 2100 planning horizon, and that those peak flows are managed to an existing condition that is calculated using the 2004 Atlas 14 data. Next slide, please. So not only is the science clear that precipitation rates are increasing, but also all of us are feeling the impacts. And Senate Bill 227 requires us to identify and investigate the areas that have experienced flooding since 2000. We know that you, the local jurisdictions, and the Maryland Department of Transportation have experienced a growing number of citizen complaints regarding flooding, are most likely collecting and tracking and evaluating this information using a variety of data management systems. So we will be reaching out to you to help gather the information necessary to identify and characterize flooding events in your jurisdictions. Now I'm going to turn this over to Brian Cooper, who is going to discuss what information MDE has collected so far. Brian.
Thank you, Jennifer. And now is actually a good time to pause and do another trivia question. So this one is, how many inches of fast-moving water can knock over an adult? Again, you may participate by using the polling function in the lower right corner of your screen. It looks like we have a number of votes coming in, and the majority are leaning to, this competition. And yeah, the answer is 6 inches. Okay. So yeah, 6 inches of fast moving water can knock over an adult. Next slide. So as Jennifer indicated, Senate Bill 227 requires the department to identify and investigate areas that have experienced flood events since 2000. And as Ray mentioned, we at the department, we did some homework and we learned that some hazard mitigation plans developed by jurisdictions in Maryland have used the storm events database made by NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. This publicly accessible database, it includes different types of weather events that occurred throughout the country from 1950 to 2021. And these events were gathered from a variety of sources and were processed by the National Weather Service as well as the NCEI. Numerous data fields exist, things like the state, the county, coordinates, dates and times of the events, the types of events, the cause of the flooding, as well as narratives describing the storm, as well as the flood and kind of what happened. So we were able to filter out a total of 2,822 flood, flash flood, coastal flooding, and storm surge or tide events that occurred in Maryland since 2000. And using the provided latitudes and longitudes, a map was created showing flooding and flash flooding events. Again, coastal flood and storm surge or tide events, they were included in the data set, but we don't know where they occurred. As in, the data set has amounts for events by county and year, but for majority of the coastal flood and storm surge events in the NCEI data set, there's no location information outside of the county. So next slide. We know that one possible application of these data is viewing trends of where more flooding has occurred. Similar to how thermal imaging cameras show cold areas as blue and areas with hot temperatures as red, a map like the one shown here could be created to display areas with lower concentrations of flooding in blue and areas with greater concentrations of flooding in red. And using this or similar methods to view trends for flooding could help select watersheds for further study. But these data need to be ground truthed and verified. While many counties have used the NCEI flood events data for hazard mitigation plans, we know that some counties have additional flood events that are not represented. Case in point, the coastal flooding. So next slide. We created a website called the Hub to assist in the StoRM process. Later this afternoon, Deb, my colleague, will discuss the information exchange and the ability to present data to the public. But we need your help to fill in the gaps with the flood events data. We need your help to add to this data set and prioritize areas for further study. So check the Hub often and stay up to date on next steps. Also, we will be forming a GIS Technical Advisory Group, or TAG, to help us determine how to best aggregate and evaluate these data. If you would like to participate in this group, more information will be provided later this afternoon explaining how to join. And now back to Jennifer, who will talk more about quantity management standards.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, let's see. Well, before we talk about changing our regulations, let's review the history of Maryland's stormwater regulations to help us understand why we are where we are today. Next slide. Stormwater runoff from new development projects has been regulated in Maryland since 1982, and we've gone through quite a few modifications along the way. In 1982, Maryland's first state stormwater management law required 2-year and 10-year peak management for all new development projects. Then in 2000, new regulations required water quality treatment of the first inch of runoff and stream channel protection. At that time, the quantity management requirement was modified from a statewide everywhere mandate to only being required in areas known to flood. And then, of course, in 2009, our regulations changed again to require environmental site design to the maximum extent practicable. Again, stormwater quantity management continued to be required statewide, but only in areas where the local jurisdiction had knowledge of flooding events or conveyance problems. Next slide. Okay, so Maryland's stormwater law requires the MDE or department to ensure that all stormwater management plans are designed to implement quantity control strategies that prevent increases in the frequency and magnitude of out-of-bank flooding from large, less frequent storms, and that watershed studies may be necessary to prevent undesirable downstream effects of increased stormwater runoff. Our regulations for stormwater quantity control standards for new development are defined in the Code of Maryland regulations and listed in this citation here on the slide. The regulations say quantity management for the 2-year or 10-year storm. Quantity management for the 2 or the 10-year storm is required when the local jurisdiction determines that additional stormwater management is necessary because historical flooding problems exist and downstream floodplain development and conveyance system design cannot be controlled. Next slide. Of course, our local jurisdictions can be more restrictive than the state minimum standards. This slide provides the latest information that MDE has on what counties and the Baltimore City are requiring currently for quantity management. Some have continued to require 2 and/or 10-year quantity management for all new development for their entire jurisdiction. Others are meeting the minimum requirement of 2 and/or 10-year management in areas where they have flooding issues. And then some go a step further. St. Mary's County, for example, requires 100-year management for all new development in the county. And for other interjurisdictional watersheds, Baltimore City and Baltimore County require 100-year management in the Gwynns Falls, Jones Falls, and Herring Run watersheds. And the City of Frederick and Frederick County require 100-year management in the Carroll Creek watershed. And then Prince George's County has gone even one step further to require overmanagement for the 100-year event for certain areas of the county where flooding problems are known to occur. So it is important for MDE to establish a baseline for quantity management across the state. As part of our response to Senate Bill 227, we would like to gather updated information on local quantity management requirements that you all have on a watershed level. And I'm going to turn this back over to Ray Barr, who is going to talk about the importance of watershed studies for mitigating flooding in Maryland. Ray?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jennifer. So in addition to the peak management strategies that Jennifer just discussed, I want to discuss a more holistic way of addressing stormwater quantity management through watershed studies and flood mitigation plans, which the A-Storm report includes as part of Maryland's plans to address current and future flooding. In watersheds where there are significant or recurring floods, a watershed analysis that shows how stormwater flows through a particular watershed can help us to better understand the cause of the flooding. For example, whether there are conveyance system limitations that can point us to the most appropriate management options. Next slide. Watershed studies and flood management plans in Maryland go back nearly half a century. In response to Tropical Storm Agnes in 1972, where there were 19 fatalities and $110 million in damages, the Maryland General Assembly established the Flood Hazard Management Act of 1976. Over the years, this program has been administered by numerous programs within DNR and more recently within MDE, and mostly exists today as our comprehensive flood management grant program that is administered by the Department's Water Quality Finance Administration. The program aims to protect local citizens from floodwaters and to develop plans to mitigate future flooding. So there's an obvious link here between this program and the requirements of Senate Bill 227 for developing additional quantity management in watersheds that flood frequently. Also recently, Maryland's National Flood Insurance Program managers, Dave Gannett and Kevin Wagner, which many of you know, have been organized into our program. And along with all of their institutional knowledge about Maryland's flood management programs, we also got their filing cabinets that stored many of these original watershed studies. Next slide, please. So here what you see are 18 of those 27 watershed studies. They're highlighted on this map. And our goal is to resurrect these plans electronically and place them up on the A-Storm hub that Brian was talking about. To our knowledge, none of these 27 watershed studies or plans have been updated since 1995, but we do know that local watershed studies and flood management plans continue to be developed. We've created a location on the A-Storm hub for collecting these more recent studies for all of us to use. So how can we use them? Well, we can help make sure that state and federal development projects are now consistent with local watershed studies. They can provide a consistent source of watershed data across political boundaries, and using these studies and plans to apply for state and federal grant money for flood mitigation projects. Next slide, please. Watershed studies and flood management plans are also included throughout our stormwater management laws and regulations. In 1982, the first stormwater management law in Maryland recognized the importance of the Flood Hazard Management Act of 1976, and that these watershed studies needed to be coordinated with the state's new stormwater management program at the time. Thus, you will see sprinkled throughout Maryland's stormwater management regulations references to these studies and how they can be used to address stormwater management in a more comprehensive fashion. So with the passage of Senate Bill 227, revisiting these watershed sections of our existing stormwater management regulations is important, and exploring how to provide Maryland's stormwater management community with better guidance on using these studies to determine appropriate quantity management in watersheds that are experiencing more and more flooding. Next slide, please. Our program is currently participating in 3 watersheds that are currently undergoing flood studies where there are already local, state, and federal agencies and resources at work. The department hopes to use these 3 watersheds as pilot study areas to begin incorporating ideas for stormwater quantity management and exploring how the stormwater sector can contribute to these ongoing efforts. And with these pilot projects and lessons learned will come more guidance for the rest of the state on how best to use watershed studies for determining appropriate quantity management. They will also provide us with the information that is necessary to apply for state and federal grants to fund flood management projects and programs. And with that lead, I would like to introduce Dave Gannett, Maryland's Flood Insurance Program Administrator. Next slide, please. Dave.
Thanks, Ray. Yes, we believe that watershed studies are a key that can help communities work towards a solution for flooding problems. Watershed studies are a key to understanding what has happened, the key to understanding what can happen, and the key to understanding and evaluating what needs to happen in a watershed. They are also a key first step to qualifying for state and federal grants. As stated earlier, watershed studies are required for the state comprehensive flood management grant funds that can be used as a federal match for federal grants, such as BRIC and FMA, but more on that in a moment. But first, we want to point out that there are currently historic levels of funding available in these 2 federal grants, 40 to 50 times more than recent years. That's estimated to reach $4 billion or more in both grants, FMA and BRIC. Next slide, please. BRIC and FMA grants are available through the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, or MDEM. You need to work with your local emergency management or hazard mitigation officer to apply. Please note that BRIC and FMA applications have a notice of intent or NOI due to MDEM before August the 1st this year. So consider applying for these federal grants to perform a watershed study. Then leverage that watershed analysis to implement possible construction solutions in another FMA or BRIC grant in a year or so. All right. We have discussed the availability of funding for watershed studies with staff from FEMA Region 3 and MDEM. BRIC and FMA grants can fund watershed studies now and remain eligible to fund construction projects in future years. We'll load that link at the bottom of this page into the chat window. BRIC and FMA grants are 75-25, which means that the local 25% match is required to receive 75% of the federal grant funds. But when state funding is also available, comprehensive flood management grant funds can provide 12.5 or half of the 25% match. State comprehensive flood management grants are also competitive. Start by contacting MDEM and applying to both. Remember, BRIC and FMA are competitive national grants. We feel that the best way to enhance your grant application is to provide a watershed study that evaluates the cause, effect, and solutions that demonstrate a plan to reduce flooding. Higher stormwater management standards are one example of a local buy-in that will demonstrate strong local support and understanding towards a solution that will enhance any grant application. For more information, go to MDEM at the address shown. Next slide, please. This slide indicates a database that was prepared last year by DNR for nuisance flood plans. These are some other grant opportunities that are out there. If you don't have the willpower for the FMA and BRIC grants, you might want to scan through these grant opportunities and see if there's something else, that a funding opportunity that's available to help out. All right. So this table has been updated since last year, and to the best of our knowledge, it includes all the grants that we're aware of that are out there as we can currently look at that. Now I'd like to turn this back over to Ray, who will add some information on stormwater management at the local level. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dave. And you all are probably waiting for anticipating exactly what it is the department is going to be proposing for stormwater quantity management. We're going to get to that next. Stuart Comstock's going to dive right into that. But before we go there, I just wanted to really quickly share with you some of the questions that we were asking ourselves as we were trying to come up with what would be the immediate regulatory changes that we wanted to address in response to Senate Bill 227. For example, the bill talks about updating existing precipitation data, but we all know, and Jennifer shared with us, how there are future projections based on climate change. So we kind of need to make that decision. Do we use the most up-to-date existing rainfall precipitation information, or do we stick our necks out there a little bit and use some of the estimates for the future? Also, if you've been doing stormwater management in Maryland, you know that our design storms typically are 24 hours. 2 years over 24 hours, 10 years over 24 hours, the 1 year storm over 24 hours. But what we've seen here today and what we're seeing more recently in the state of Maryland, the storms that are causing the flooding are 3 hour and 6 hour storms. So should we begin to look at those duration storm events for our stormwater management criteria? And then what type of quantity management criteria should we be considering? The 2 year and the 10 year quantity management, peak flow management requirements pre and post were required formally in the state of Maryland before the year 2000, but now it's only required in areas where there is downstream flooding. Should we come up with some sort of statewide quantity management criteria moving forward? And or should we add additional requirements for watersheds with known flooding events? So maybe some combination of the two. Or should we develop watershed studies and flood management plans? Should it be mandated across the entire jurisdiction? One thing that we do not want to do is we do not want to implement something that's going to make flooding worse. So we need to take our time and be careful and make sure that anything that we propose is going to help the solution. So with that, Stu is going to talk about some short-term regulatory updates, and then I'll share some longer-term ideas with you. Stuart?
Thank you, Ray, and good afternoon, everyone. As Ray mentioned, I'm here to talk a little bit about some things that we are considering doing in the short term to help with resilience and climate change. Next slide, please. This map in front of you showing the state of Maryland also shows the projected Atlas 14 change factors in percentage that the Marissa tool has predicted for across the state. These range from 8% to as much as 13–14% across the state. There is some variation and there's no specific pattern. And the average value of this increase is about 10%. We are currently considering changing the ESD volume to reflect these changes in statewide precipitation patterns. So let's talk about that. Next slide, please. First, let's be clear. ESD is required by state law. It's part of the Environment Article, Section 4-203. It was designed to address receiving channel erosion control and was based on a 1 year, 24-hour storm averaged across the state, or approximately 2.7 inches of rainfall. We know that the average annual rainfall and the less frequent design storms are increasing. We also know that recent studies show that runoff and peak flows were reduced using ESD practices, distributed throughout a neighborhood as compared to a few large stormwater facilities. Less runoff and lower peak flows reduces downstream impacts and helps to mitigate flooding. However, there is flexibility built into the ESD to the MVP standard, and structural practices may be used where appropriate to allow for a variety of intensity storms to be managed. This allows for more flood control management where it is warranted. So, ESD is not going to go away. And we know that more frequent design storms that are addressed by ESD are increasing. However, the available tools like the Marissa tool do not provide climate change predictions for these more frequent lower storms. We know that they are predicting that larger storms are expected to increase by 10% or so on average across the state. And we at MDE believe that ESD should change accordingly or increase from 2.7 inches to 3.0 inches. Next slide, please. Another option that Ray just mentioned, and that is under discussion, is the use of shorter duration design storms for quantity control and flood management requirements. If we're seeing more frequent damaging events that are 6 hours or 3 hours in duration, maybe we should be changing the design storms to reflect those. So how does a change to the ESD volume affect these shorter duration storms? This map shows the projected changes to the 10-year 6-hour design storm for selected counties across the state. While there is some variation, and the storms do increase moving eastward, the average value of the 10-year 6-hour design storm is 3.6 inches. Because the ESD requirement is a volume that is captured, treated, and filtered, capturing this volume for a large percentage of the rainfall associated with the shorter duration rainfall events will have a significant effect on flooding downstream. Next slide, please. So what time frame are we talking about here? And I noticed from the attendance list that there are many of you out there who were with us the last time we did this. So you understand what I'm talking about here. The existing regulations and the design manual were developed over many years. We started the process in 1995, and we published the first draft of the design manual in 1997. After several more drafts, we published the final draft and the associated regulations that were not adopted until October of 2000. In 2007, we started working on the supplement to the design manual to incorporate ESD as mandated by the 2000 Stormwater Management Act. This abbreviated process, and by abbreviated, we did not redo the whole entire design manual. We only redid chapters 5 and select portions of chapter 1 and some of the appendices. This abbreviated process led to the incorporation of Supplement 1 and new regulations in 2009. However, these regulations were not adopted statewide until 2010 and were not implemented statewide until 2013. So implementing new regulations for stormwater management is not an overnight event. This will take time. However, it is now 2022. It's been 22 years since we adopted the first design manual and the foundation of the current stormwater management regs. And it's now time to contribute our knowledge and experience for the next generation of stormwater management designers and plan reviewers. To do this, we will be forming a technical advisory group, or TAG, and we'll be asking for your help. So if you're interested in contributing to this effort as part of a stormwater management technical advisory group, I look forward to working with you as you move forward. More information on how to tell us you're interested in this will be forthcoming. Thank you.
Thanks, Stu. So in addition to some of these short-term regulatory updates that we might be able to make, for example, the precipitation data that Jennifer talked about, and the ESD sizing proposal that Stu just made, there are some additional stormwater management regulations that we've been talking about down here. For example, requiring a statewide quantity management standard like we had previously with the 2-year and the 10-year peak management, only this time with the Pittsburgh twist. And as Jennifer explained it, managing the estimated future rainfall discharge rates back to historical discharge rates to reduce flooding. The A-Storm report has already mentioned the state's intent to require watershed studies for determining quantity management in areas that flood frequently. So how should we go about doing this? Should the department prioritize and select these watersheds from across the state for this level of additional management? That's what was embodied in the Flood Hazard Management Act of 1976. Or should we change it for the stormwater regulations and allow the locals to prioritize their watersheds and select them for additional quantity management? Or, as I mentioned before, should all watersheds that have experienced flooding since 2000 be mandated to have a watershed study and a flood management plan? Again, we need to remember that these regulations are only for new and redevelopment, but the watershed studies could be used to inform other programs that can help to mitigate flooding in these areas. Next slide, please. For example, are there opportunities to combine these watershed studies for stormwater management with other programs and regulations in developing more comprehensive flood management plans? Currently, there's a push by DNR and the Office of Planning to require the nuisance flooding plans that Jennifer talked about earlier, integrating them better with the county's hazard mitigation plans every 5 years. Is that something that we should contemplate, adding the urban stormwater management, urban flooding, pluvial flooding mitigation plans as part of hazard mitigation plans? Are there opportunities to use these watershed studies as a basis for updating floodplain or dam safety regulations? For example, where dams are involved, do we need to be more prescriptive regarding new development occurring above or below a dam, or in the design of that dam in order to manage hazard creep? So now what I'd like to do is introduce the other co-manager of Maryland's flood insurance program, Kevin Wagner, to discuss how the state stormwater management program and floodplain management program can be better integrated. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you, Ray. Cue the game show music. All right, we got time for another trivia question here. So if you remember, you go back to the little activities icon to find the polls there. But true or false? Floods are the most common natural disaster. All right, got a 36 votes for true, a few false. And just as a reminder, if you join, you can post your questions in the Q&A. We're going to take them all at the end. So as you think about them, just please use that activities icon and post it in the Q&A. So let's see the answer, Christina. The answer is true. You all knew that. According to the World Health Organization, floods are the most common disaster in the world and are increasing in frequency and intensity. And of course, it is the most common natural hazard in the state of Maryland as well. All right, next slide, please. So I'm really excited to be a part of the Stormwater Dam Safety and Flood Management team and working with Jay and I call Jay and Jennifer. I kind of mix some names there together. Jennifer and Ray and Stu and Debbie and all the folks that we get to work with. But you know, we as floodplain managers, we have a seat at the table here. So I think it's a great opportunity, and I noticed a lot of familiar names of people I work with regularly throughout the state. So I appreciate y'all being here today. But for those that aren't familiar with the National Flood Insurance Program, as some additional background, every Maryland jurisdiction that has land use authority has responsibilities through its participation in the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. For most of the communities in Maryland, that didn't begin until the late 70s or early 80s. So, you know, it's a fairly young program, if you will, as far as floodplain management goes. And Jennifer did cover that earlier on, that it began in 1968. And also, as Jennifer mentioned, we have 147 participating communities in the NFIP in Maryland. So that's obviously all 23 counties, Baltimore City, and 123 additional municipalities. But participation in the NFIP, of course, provides access to federal flood insurance, but it does more. And these things sometimes get overlooked. So that's access to grants and loans, access to federal disaster assistance. So, you know, we're here to help support you through this information. So anytime you have questions, of course, about anything flood related, please feel free to come to me or one of our FEMA contacts. We're always glad to help. Of those 147 communities, 16 of them, as Jennifer mentioned, participate in the NFIP's community rating system. I like to refer to that program as like the varsity team of floodplain management. But the reality is we have a lot of communities all over the state doing great work. Many of them are on the call today. And many of them are trying to join this program and are in various stages of applying. So we do have 6 more. And some of them are in this eastern region. So we look forward to eventually getting them into the program after we get through some of the formal audit process that they're dealing with. But participation in the community rating system, it puts a community on a path to being more flood resilient, because you may get credit for higher standards like building codes and things like that. But it also provides a discount on federal flood insurance. And that's what a lot of communities are really after, trying to save people money. And the really neat thing is that FEMA kind of has been adjusting the way they're doing insurance rating. So instead of just the discount being applied to in the floodplain, they are applying the discount community-wide now. There's certain caveats with things, but generally speaking, everybody in the community, if you're a CRS community, will get a discount on flood insurance. That's a big deal. And those discount rates, they range from 5% discount all the way to 25%. So Baltimore City and Prince George's County, both of those jurisdictions, they're seeing 25% discounts. But just like stormwater management ordinances require, plan approval, inspection, and enforcement, so do the local floodplain management ordinances. There's a development review process, and it all begins with the FEMA floodplain mapping. In that mapping, it does rely on the 1% annual chance flood or 100-year flood, and we know that it's flooding beyond those boundaries. But communities have an opportunity. They can adopt higher standards and regulate areas that are beyond the FEMA map floodplain. But some other higher standards are things like freeboard, building higher, a factor of safety. So instead of doing the minimum to the base flood elevation, go 2 feet higher or even 3 feet higher. And we do have communities that do have a 3-foot freeboard. So I think the town of Oxford is one, St. Mary's County, and I think maybe some portions of Ocean City are a few examples. So anyway, there's a lot of things that you could do to get extra credit. And hey, we talked about the climate ready action boundary, that FEMA elevation +3. That could be another area that maybe you could get some credit for. But again, the benefits of adopting higher standards, of course, it does include reduced flood risk that protects lives and property, but it also can result in saving people money, and that's a good thing. Some other types of credit examples of things you can get credit for are like stormwater management. So a lot of the things we're discussing today, and having a state stormwater management program, floodplain management planning, flood mitigation plans, watershed studies. I believe as long as it has a flood component to it, you could get CRS credit for that. Drainage system maintenance, flood warning and response, having a state dam safety program and all the information behind that. These are all things that we can get CRS credit for. So there's a lot of crossover opportunities, I think, between stormwater management and floodplain management. Some other things that come to mind are like storm drain stenciling, maintenance, and these credits could tie into not only for the community rating system, but also for your MS4 permitting requirements. But But anyway, this collaborative effort through A-Storm, it really does provide an opportunity for stormwater managers and floodplain managers to work together and reduce flood risk in your community. So now I am going to turn it over to Deb Capaciti, who will talk about the A-Storm Hub. Deb?
Hi, Kevin. Thank you. Okay, so as Kevin noted, this is a good opportunity to integrate flood management programs with where we're going with the A-Storm process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to move forward in that direction. One of the components on our A-Storm Hub we are calling Information Exchange. So basically what we're looking to do is compile information on existing local flood management policies and tools. These we've already spoken about before, but why compile this information? You might know you have it, but a lot of your neighboring jurisdictions can benefit from this information, and also the public at large can benefit. And of course, we've found a lot of useful information as we've been learning about your programs. So what are we looking to compile? We've talked about this, hazard mitigation plans, where you have identified your hazard, flood hazard areas, and also identified mitigation strategies and so forth, and local flood management mitigation plans, where that recognizes all sources of flooding, not just hazard sources of flooding. And of course, comprehensive plans that kind of integrate all these plans together. Flood management ordinances Kevin just, he just kind of spoke about that for us. And many of you have been involved in the nuisance flood plan process. So, as you know, this is tidally focused. A lot of those strategies translate into where we're going with A-Storm, but also many of you even looked at a lot of urban flooding as well as nuisance flooding. So this is very useful for all of us as we move forward. So we can go to the next slide. And what are we gonna do with all this information? So we've spoken a bit about our direction on the stormwater side, but how can we integrate this local knowledge into stormwater planning and where we're going to go with that? So as an example, you've identified a lot of your flood prone areas and flood hazard areas. Well, maybe that can help us identify which watersheds we should be doing in-depth watershed hydrology analysis, and maybe help us target which watersheds we should be requiring more specific quantity management requirements. Maybe some of these plans have already identified capital improvement projects, and they can be integrated into potentially stormwater management plans. So we can go to the next slide. And so ultimately, we'd like to sort of integrate this information as Les had kind of indicated prior. Let's look at what's working. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, but let's look at what's working and let's integrate that into the stormwater planning process. And then as we do that and we develop more detailed plans on the stormwater side, then that can be fed into future hazard mitigation plans. And then of course, that unlocks the funding eligibility for a lot of federal grants like FEMA grants and so forth. So this is kind of a new process for us, and we need your input, and we're going to be reaching out to you to get more input from you on your local programs. We can go to the last slide, and I will leave you with what we have currently on the A-Storm Hub, and Christina's putting a link up for you there. But what we have currently on the A-Storm Hub, and check back, please, and we'll also send you notifications when we do kind of a major, update. But what we're going to look to do is, compile this information, and you'll be able to click around the state and be able to find out what other people are doing around the state. And so look for our notifications, and we will be looking forward to working with you. And I think Jennifer is going to be ready to take us home.
Thank you, Deb. I think we're now nearing the end of today's presentation, and I wanted to leave you with some key take-home points. First, flooding is a problem in Maryland, and it's going to continue, especially with the changing climate, and flood mitigation is going to require a comprehensive effort. We will all need to continue to identify where flooding problems are occurring and prioritize these areas on a watershed basis. Comprehensive watershed studies will be needed that evaluate the existing conveyance system limitations and that identify and recommend flood mitigation solutions. And these solutions will need to include not only stormwater management and floodplain regulations to address new and redevelopment, but also conveyance system upgrades and maintenance, flood acquisitions and warning systems, comprehensive hazard mitigation plans, and extremely important, a focus on education and outreach to inform our citizens, especially those in the most vulnerable communities, of the hazards of flooding to improve preparedness. And of course, all of this is going to require a dedicated funding source. And as Dave mentioned, there is currently an increase in the available funding for both studies and solutions through FEMA's BRIC grants and FEMA's Flood Mitigation Assistant grants. And MDE hopes to provide additional dedicated funding resources to local jurisdictions in the near future. There are many programs at the state, federal, and local level that are involved in this in some way. And for us all to be successful, we will need to coordinate and build on the efforts across the state agencies and between the state and local programs. We all need to work together to solve the challenge of flooding prevention and resiliency. And this is just the first step in a long process that will continue into the future. Next slide. Now, speaking of the future, where do we go from here? First, let me remind everybody that the recording of this presentation will be posted on our Hub website in the very near future, and that future meeting dates, including the technical advisory meetings, group meetings, will be posted on this website as well. Also, questions posted in the Q&A and the answers for these sessions will be collected and provided and posted on our Project Hub website as well. Okay, now through the end of June 2022, MDE will be reaching out to you all, our local jurisdictions, to ground truth the data that Brian Cooper demonstrated and collect any additional information that you have on local flooding events. We will also be reaching out to you to verify and update the information that we have on your local stormwater quantity management requirements. And of course, we will be updating our Hub website with this information as it becomes available. We will also be establishing the stakeholder group that is required as part of the Senate Bill 227 requirements. And from June until the end of the summer, MDE will be working with a few different technical advisory groups to develop proposed regulation changes, update our information on flooding events, help develop GIS analysis tools, and developed an informed process for performing watershed studies. Again, if you are interested in taking part in any one of these technical advisory groups, please contact Stu Comstock. His contact information will be available at the end of today's presentation. Let's see, towards the end of the summer and into the late fall, MDE will collaborate with the stakeholder advisory group to discuss any initial proposals of regulation changes. And then phase 3 of the project will occur in late 2022 and into early 2023, when MDE will publish proposed regulation changes for public input. However, we do not plan to stop there. MDE will continue to identify additional funding opportunities. We will continue to collaborate with the local and state agencies, and we will continue our efforts of data sharing and the development of data exchange and analysis tools. So let's see, as Lee said at the beginning of today's presentation, April is Maryland's Flood Awareness Month. And so I'm going to turn this back over to Kevin, who's going to provide some information on upcoming activities and events. Kevin, take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, April is Maryland's Flood Awareness Month. So I think it was Matt that had made that announcement early on in his opening remarks, and Jennifer just mentioned again. But this kicked off last year by Governor Hogan. He did a formal proclamation, and some of our partners actually did their own county proclamation. So that was really cool. And in fact, I think Queen Anne's County just did their proclamation. What was it, last week or something like that? But this event is sponsored by the Maryland Resiliency Partnership, and that is a collaboration, really, of federal, state, and local government partners, nonprofits, private, and academia working together for a more flood resilient Maryland. So the target audience of this is all Marylanders. We don't want to miss anybody. We want to hit, you know, the renters. We want to hit the homeowners, the business owners, the students and teachers. You name it, and we want to try to get some kind of a message to them, whether it's turn around, don't drown, or check the map or something. But this year's theme is know, plan, and act. So know your flood risk, make a plan to reduce that flood risk, and finally take action. Most importantly, talk with your family, friends, and neighbors. Share some information with each other. Maybe build an emergency kit. Are you prepared for 72 hours without power if you needed to be? Elevate things off the floor. If you're in a vulnerable area and you know things are going to get soggy and wet, maybe there's a way to get it up on a shelf or something like that. Check your sump pump. Make sure you have a battery backup. Purchase flood insurance would be really awesome. Again, there's a lot of different things you could do. But we really welcome you to get involved. I know you have a lot of social media access through not only your organizations, but you know, maybe personally. So all of our partners are sharing information, various state agencies. So if you want to share that information, we also have a community toolkit that I could get to you. I will put my email in the chat, and if that's of interest, I could send that to you. We have a lot of great information. But on social media, use the hashtag FloodAwareMD. Please check the Resiliency Partnership for information on events and how you can get involved. And, you know, we want you to be a part of it. So that is all I have. Back to you, Christina.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. As has been discussed earlier in the presentation, numerous technical advisory groups will be formed in the process to ensure we engage the experts in the field and those who can provide valuable contributions to help reach our goals of advancing stormwater resiliency in Maryland. The first groups that will help propel this work forward are the GIS, Stormwater Management, and Watershed Study Technical Advisory Groups. If you are interested in being part of one of these groups, please contact Stu. Before we move on, I would like to say a big thank you to all of the presenters and to Michelle Crawford, who has been advancing the slides. Now we will turn to the Q&A. It is not too late to submit a comment, so please feel free to continue to do so. If we run out of time, these questions will be included in those addressed on the website. Okay. Now for the first question. New to design development review. However, as we interpret the 2.7 inch requirement, that is the ESD volume for the overall site, but each individual practice is only held to 1 inch. And that seems to be the minimum standard we hold to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. This is a good question. There's always been a lot of confusion about this. The idea is the design is supposed to be implementing ESD to the maximum extent practicable up to the level stipulated in Chapter 5 in that table 5.3. So that's based on 2.7 inches of rainfall, and it can be as much as 2.6 inches for the design. Now, maximum extent practicable is a design standard that has got some judgment factor to it, and as a reviewer, you're going to have to determine whether or not the design can do more or not. As a minimum, they can do 1 inch, but they're not supposed to stop at the 1 inch minimum. It's not go to 1 inch and stop. It's go until you can do no more and then stop. And then the rest can be done in a structural practice. So if you've got applicants stopping just at 1 inch and saying, oh, we're putting the rest in another practice, they have to be able to justify that. They have to be able to show that that is their maximum extent practicable. If not, then as a plan reviewer, you can request more.
Okay, thank you, Stu. The next question, will you also be collecting information about hydraulic modeling and mapping? We've learned that A, many schematics are outdated, B, they are very sketchy and don't include all nodes, and C, they don't usually include dynamic modeling. How the gray infrastructure functions is a key component.
Someone's very astute. Thank you. Exactly. Yes, we are collecting it when the locals come up with a plan that they want to attack and do a study. So we'd like to at least help by publishing that information on our website. Watershed boundaries don't stop at county and local boundaries. So if somebody's doing something in the same watershed, then we'd want to make it available to the rest of the communities in that watershed to learn from. Gray infrastructure is exactly, like one of the big, I guess, keys here. What's going on under those roads? What are their capacity is a key component, and really gets into these watershed plans, whether or not you need a 1D or 2-dimensional model to collect all that information that's sort of subsurface and all the little nodes of where the water can go. So yes, I'd say you hit a home run on that one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dave. We have a couple of questions from Ali. We are attempting an incentive program to reward quantity control retrofit. I'm unsure of the next part of this question. Retaining 2-year, 24-hour, 2.7 inches.
Ray, I think that, or Christina, I think that's, he's asking about MS4 credits for quantity management for the 2-year storm.
Gotcha. Okay.
So there are MS4 credits that go above the 2.7 inches and up to 3 inches. Some of them are for quality control. Some of them are for quantity control. Maybe somebody can put a link to our MS4 guidance into the chat function. So yes, we have taken advantage of the MS4 permits and our guidance documents for credits towards the Bay to add some incentives for more climate resiliency. You would get more credit. If you are a non-MS4, which I know there's a lot of people on this call from counties that are not MS4s, you could use this as an incentive as well. We'd have to look into that a little bit more, but through trading, if you could provide additional quality and quantity management above that 2.7 inches, there may be an opportunity for you to trade for that, use it in your county WIP plan, or maybe trade with a MS4 on the Eastern Shore or Southern Maryland that does have a permit. So we would like to discuss that with you further, if that's what you're asking, Ali. And then, of course, there's going to be a record. We're going to put this presentation up on our A-Hub that's been talked about today, and all of the questions that appear here in the question and answer, we're going to roll all of that up into a Q&A fact sheet that we're going to put up on the A-Hub. So if you got any really good last minute questions, now would be a good time to put it into the Q&A.
Yeah, and let me just reiterate, not only are we going to have a recording, but we will also have a PDF of the actual slides available.
Okay, it looks like the next question is directed towards Kevin.
Hey, Ali. Yeah, I see your question there. And I think you're asking, is there a grant for flood mitigation plan for a community that has already done one in 2008? So, Ali, I think you're part of Tacoma Park, if I'm not mistaken. And so that would be part of Montgomery County. And my understanding, the way the hazard mitigation planning process works is the county is sort of, doing it for the entire county and includes the municipalities. So flooding would certainly be one component, but if you had already done a specific flood mitigation plan for Tacoma Park, that's great, first of all, and we would love to see that information and maybe share that with us through the hub. But yeah, I mean, if you wanted to apply for a grant, you could certainly do that through MDEM. It's what we talked about, the BRIC and the FMA, the flood mitigation assistance. So there's different, potential funding mechanisms. And as we also talked about, we're trying to get the state grant, the Comprehensive Flood Management Grant Program, to a point where we could be funding, studies and things like that. So for now, it's kind of we're shifting it to FEMA. So, work with your partners in the county. I think it's Michael Baldasser is the emergency management planner with the county. He would be a great person to start with and kind of, start exploring that. I don't know where the county is on their hazard mitigation plan update, but it's really important to make that connection between the hazard mitigation plan to projects. So these things need to kind of work with one another. So hopefully that addressed your question.
Great, thank you, Kevin. The next question, are you going to look at minimum ESDs implemented and at frequency of waivers?
Those are good questions, and we do look at the frequency of waivers as we analyze the MS4 communities in the annual reports and when we do triennial reviews. So we do that when we do program evaluations, and nothing's off the table at this point. We may look at the minimum number of ESDs implemented. We may look at other issues there. So if you're interested, and I believe some people have already asked about this, sign up for one of the technical advisory groups and you'll be probably able to help us do this work. I want to put out a quick plug. Some of you from the Eastern Shore been around a while, even some of the new guys, we'd like to have you represented as well. So if you're interested, please sign up for one of our technical advisory groups. We need your help.
Great, thank you, Stu. The next question, will MDE wait until the next generation of MS4 permit terms to incorporate any new requirements, or is MDE planning to do amendments to permits already issued final determination?
Well, this is kind of a tricky question depending on who you are, because we have some phase ones online, we've got some phase twos, and we've got some municipalities that are mostly phase twos, and we've got some Maryland Department of Transportation agencies as well. So I can say that for the phase ones, both the large and medium jurisdictions, the guidance got issued along with the permit, so it's available for them now. For the phase twos, Deb might want to comment on that and how we're using. I don't believe we're using the phase one MS4 guidance, those updates yet for the phase twos. They have their own guidance that appears in the back of in the general permit in the appendix section. And if this question is coming from SHA, their permit is currently expired, and we are fervently working on your draft permit in addition to all this A-storm work that we're doing. So, at some point we will get you a draft, but I would imagine incorporating any additional climate resiliency. That's the way we're going. That's what this whole meeting was about. So I think in all three instances, there will be more credit for more volume in stormwater management facilities in the future. Thank you for that question. Good question.
Can I jump in, Christina, on the phase two end?
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've told all of our phase twos that they are required to use the guidance under the 2014 guidance, but that does not preclude them from looking into the opportunities that is in the 2021 guidance currently. But we can't change the rules on you in the middle of your permit. So your permit says 2014 guidance, but we are, we have been working with folks who come in with requests on a case-by-case basis. And so I don't want anybody to think that there's opportunities there that you can't look into.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Ray mentioned. Please understand that regulatory changes to the stormwater management program, because they're referenced in the MS4 permits, changes to the regulatory programs are automatically incorporated into those permits. So you'd have to read the permit for the exact language. But if we change the stormwater management program, if we change the stormwater management regulations, that is automatically recognized in the NPDES permits that are issued. So we wouldn't necessarily need to modify them.
Okay, thank you, Ray, Deb, and Stu. We have one follow-up clarification for Kevin. It is on our webpage from Ali. There are no more questions in the Q&A. I'll give it a couple of moments. Please feel free. There's still 5 minutes if you want to slip in another question. Otherwise, please feel free to email Stu with follow-up questions. We will make sure that they're responded to and incorporated onto our Q&A on the website. Okay, well, seeing none, I am going to call this meeting to a close. Again, thank you for your participation, your attention to this effort, and your questions. Please send follow-up questions again to Stu, and we do hope that you become directly involved. And if you're interested in one of the technical advisory committees, please reach out. Thank you so much for your participation today.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Good to see everybody. Have a good day.